Here is your original 3,000-word script, written entirely in paragraph form, drawing ideas from the reference but with fully original content and authentic sourcing. There is a peculiar kind of silence that only exists in one place on Earth, and that is a half-second pause between Johnny Carson delivering a punchline and the audience deciding whether to laugh. In that fraction of time, you could feel the entire weight of late-night television history pressing against the air, because this wasn't just any comedian working any stage. This was Johnny Carson, the man who, for 30 years straight, had America tucked in every single weeknight. He was the last friendly face millions of people saw before they closed their eyes, and he earned that trust not through Polish alone, but through something far rarer. He was genuinely, authentically, helplessly funny, and tonight, we are going back to the greatest jokes, the most legendary one-liners, and the most hysterical moments that ever unfolded under the lights of The Tonight Show. Not the rehearsed ones. Not the carefully workshop bits that a committee approved on a Tuesday afternoon. The real ones. The ones that happened when something went sideways, or when a comedian walked in and set the room on fire, or when Johnny Carson simply opened his mouth at exactly the right second and said exactly the right thing. Every great comedian has a relationship with failure. Most of them fear it. Johnny Carson turned it into its own comedic discipline. The Tonight Show monologue was a nightly high-wire act. 8 to 10 minutes of topical humor, delivered alone, directly to the camera, with no safety net. Carson would stand at that famous curtain, step out into the light, and begin working through jokes that his writing staff had prepared about that day's headlines. Sometimes the material was sharp, and the audience rewarded it immediately. But sometimes, and this is where Carson separated himself from every other performer of his era, the jokes landed with a kind of silence that you could practically see. A flat, dense, humbling silence. And in those moments, Johnny Carson did something remarkable. He refused to pretend it hadn't happened. His go-to response to a bomb joke became one of the most beloved rituals in television history. He would stop. He would look directly into the camera with an expression of complete calm. Then he would say something along the lines of, "That is going to be a big joke in Paraguay." The line acknowledged a failure, mocked his own material, and connected him instantly to the audience at home, who were watching from their living rooms and bedrooms and laughing not at the original joke but at the shared recognition that, yes, that one didn't work, and Johnny knew it, and somehow that honesty was funnier than the joke itself ever could have been. There was also the legendary soft shoe. When the monologue went particularly sideways on a bad night, Carson would set down his notes and, without a word, begin performing a shuffling vaudeville-style dance across the stage. No music, no explanation, just Johnny Carson, sliding and tapping his way back and forth in front of the curtain, while Ed McMahon's enormous laugh filled the studio. The audience didn't need an explanation. They had watched this man long enough to understand that the soft shoe was his white flag, his comedic surrender, his way of saying, "The jokes have failed us tonight, but we are going to find a way through this together." And somehow, every single time, they did. Carson often said that his writers were brilliant, but that live television was its own author. A joke that killed in the writer's room at 4 in the afternoon could arrive stone dead on stage at 11:30 at night, and there was simply no way to predict which direction the wind would blow. What you could control was what happened after, and that, he understood, was where character revealed itself. If you were to gather every comedy writer who ever lived and ask them to construct the single most perfectly absurd setup for a one-liner, none of them would dare write what actually happened on The Tonight Show stage on April 27, 1965, because it would seem too convenient, too impossible, too perfectly orchestrated to be believable. And yet it happened in front of a live studio audience and captured by multiple cameras, which means the universe occasionally writes better comedy than any human being is capable of producing. The guest was Ed Ames, an actor who at the time was widely known for playing Mingo, the Native American companion on the hit television series Daniel Boone. Ames was not coming on the show to discuss his acting career that evening. He was there to demonstrate tomahawk throwing, a skill he had apparently developed while preparing for his role. The prop department had arranged for a large wooden silhouette of a cowboy to be positioned at the far end of the stage. The plan was simple. Ames would throw the tomahawk. It would stick in the wooden target. They would discuss it briefly, then move along to the interview portion of the show. Ames stepped up, took aim with the studied concentration of a man who had done this many times, and released the tomahawk. It sailed across the stage in a clean arc. and buried itself in the wooden cowboy with a loud, satisfying thunk. The audience saw where it had landed before Carson did. The gasps came first, a wave of shocked recognition rippling through the studio, followed immediately by laughter that began quietly and then built and built until it had become something enormous and uncontrollable. The tomahawk had not landed in the torso or the shoulder or the arm. It had landed with extraordinary, anatomically specific precision directly between the wooden cowbell's legs. The placement, had it been intentional, would have been considered too crude to air. Carson turned to look. He processed what he was seeing. He did not rush. He did not immediately reach for a punchline. He let the laughter swell. He understood that the audience's reaction was part of the comedy, and that interrupting it prematurely would diminish the moment. When the laughter had reached its peak and was just beginning to turn the corner, Carson walked toward the target, surveyed the situation with the expression of a man conducting a very serious inspection, and then turned back to Ed Ames and delivered with absolute deadpan certainty the line that would be repeated for the next 60 years. "I didn't even know you were Jewish." The studio erupted in a way that is difficult to describe accurately in print. Ed Ames doubled forward. The audience howled. Carson himself, despite every professional instinct to maintain composure, fought visibly to keep his face straight. The joke had worked not because it was crude, but because it was perfectly timed, perfectly constructed, and delivered by a man who had the confidence to wait for exactly the right moment rather than rushing to fill the silence. Every attempt to move on from the moment failed. Carson would glance back at the target. The audience would start again, and eventually he simply left the tomahawk exactly where it had landed and conducted the rest of the interview with it visible in the background as a recurring source of fresh eruptions from the crowd. The moment has never been surpassed in the history of talk show television. Johnny Carson played many characters over the course of his 3 decades on The Tonight Show, but none became more beloved or more closely associated with his legacy than Karnak the Magnificent. The premise was deceptively simple. Carson would emerge in a magnificent turban and flowing robes, assuming the persona of a mystic sage from the East who possessed a supernatural ability to divine the answers to questions that were sealed inside hermetically sealed envelopes. The comedy came from the structure of the bit. Karnak would hold the envelope to his turban, solemnly announce the answer, then tear open the envelope and read the question aloud. The humor lived in the gap between those two things, in the unexpected and often absurd connection between the question and its answer. The Karnak sketches produced hundreds of memorable jokes over the years. Carson and his writers understood that the format was both flexible and durable. It could accommodate political humor, wordplay, observational comedy, and pure nonsense with equal ease. But of all the Karnak jokes that Carson delivered during his tenure, one stands out above all others, not because it was the cleverest joke ever written for the segment, but because of what it did to the man delivering it. On one particular evening in 1974, Carson held the sealed envelope to his turbaned forehead with the grave ceremony the bit required, and announced the answer with all the mystical authority he could summon. Sis-boom ba. Then he tore open the envelope, removed the card, and read the question aloud. Describe the sound made when a sheep explodes. Something about the combination of those words, the cheerleader chant rhythmically familiar from childhood, colliding head-on with a completely absurd and unexpected image of an exploding sheep, broke Johnny Carson in a way that almost nothing else in 30 years of television ever managed to do. He began laughing, not the polished, controlled, socially appropriate laughter that a professional host deploys during a guest's anecdote. Real laughter, helpless, undignified, shoulder-shaking, desk-gripping laughter that rendered him temporarily unable to function as a television host. He tried to pick up the next envelope and could not. He looked at Ed McMahon, and McMahon's booming response only made things worse. Carson slumped forward with his head nearly on the desk, tears streaming freely, gasping for breath between waves of laughter that refused to subside. "I'm sorry," he managed eventually. "I genuinely do not know why that is as funny as it is." But he did know, even if he couldn't articulate it in that moment. The joke worked because it was perfectly innocent right up until the last word, and that last word detonated with the force of something completely unexpected. The studio audience, watching television's most composed and professional host completely disintegrate, laughed harder than they had at the joke itself. Carson's breakdown was a real punchline, and it was a punchline that no writer had written and no producer had planned. It simply happened, and the cameras were there to catch it. There is a very specific kind of courage required to allow someone to mock you in front of millions of people, and respond by laughing harder than anyone else in the room. Most public figures, especially those who have spent decades building an image and cultivating an audience, are constitutionally incapable of it. Johnny Carson was a rare exception, and nowhere was this more visible than in his interactions with Don Rickles, the legendary insult comedian who treated the Tonight Show desk as both his stage and his weapon. Rickles had a relationship with Carson that was unlike anything else in television. He would arrive for his appearances, exchange a warm handshake, take his seat, and then immediately pivot to the kind of personal attack that would have ended most professional relationships on the spot. He targeted everything: Carson's multiple divorces, his wealth, his alleged aloofness, his reputation for maintaining friendships primarily with people who could do something for him. "Nobody in this town actually likes you, Johnny," Rickles would declare with total conviction. "They want to be on television. You're the toll booth on the highway to fame." Carson would lean back in his chair, cigarette in hand, and laugh with genuine delight. He didn't deflect. He didn't attempt to redirect. He simply absorbed the attack and let the audience see that it delighted him. This willingness to be the target, to surrender the position of authority that the host chair normally confers and become instead the subject of ridicule, was one of the most disarming and endearing things Carson ever did on camera. What Rickles understood, and what Carson clearly enjoyed, was that the insults only worked because of the affection underneath them. There was no cruelty in what Rickles did to Carson. There was love disguised as destruction, and an audience that had watched both men for years understood the distinction immediately. When Rickles called Carson friendless and mercenary and lucky rather than talented, everyone in that room knew he was saying precisely the opposite. And Carson's laughter, open, uninhibited, completely without defensiveness, confirmed it every time. The Tonight Show had seen thousands of comedians walk through its curtain over the decades. Some were good, some were great. A very small number were genuinely exceptional. But there is substantial evidence that nothing in the show's history quite prepared anyone, not the producers, not the audience, and certainly not Johnny Carson himself, for what happened on October 23, 1981, when a relatively unknown comedian named Robin Williams made his first Tonight Show appearance. Williams arrived on the stage like a weather event. Within seconds of the applause dying down, he was in motion, physically, vocally, and conceptually, moving between characters, accents, and premises at a speed that made it genuinely difficult for the audience to track what were happening. He spotted a Japanese newspaper on Carson's desk and was immediately inside an improvised scene involving confused Japanese businessmen. He pivoted without warning into an extended piece about a chihuahua in a cup. He launched into voices and physical transformations that had the studio audience simultaneously laughing and gasping. Throughout it all, Carson sat forward in his chair with an expression that veteran Tonight Show watchers had almost never seen on his face. He looked genuinely astonished, not politely attentive, not professionally engaged, but actually legitimately stunned by what he was witnessing. When Williams finally arrived at the desk and sat down, Carson leaned forward and said, with complete sincerity and zero condescension, "God, you're weird." It was the most honest review possible. It was also, coming from Johnny Carson, one of the highest compliments in the history of